Welcome to Savage Minds. This is the first episode of our fourth season. Today's guest is Joti Brar. Joti has been an active communist for 30 years and active in her former trade union, Bektu, the Palestinian Solidarity Movement, and the anti-war movement, amongst other activities. She was a member of and a parliamentary candidate for Arthur Scargill's SLP in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Then she was a founding member of the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist, aka CPGB-ML, aka the Communists, which celebrates its 20th anniversary next month. She is currently the vice chair of CPGB-ML and the party's publications officer, and she's also the international spokesperson for the World Anti-Imperialist Platform founded in 2022. She's editor of the party's website, thecommunists.org, and the newspaper Proletarian, as well as being the author of two small books, The Drive to War Against Russia and China and Identity Politics or Class Politics. She is a contributing author to several other party pamphlets to include Capitalism and Immigration, The Rise and Fall of Project Corbyn, and Manifesto for the Crisis, Class Against Class. I welcome Joti Brar to Savage Minds. I tortured you by having you listen to that piece by Jordan Peterson. That's just one of many things that Peterson has said over the years about communism. If you have followed the works of people like James Lindsay on Twitter and many others, it's just a neoliberal world and even right-wing world of people out there who have loads of misconceptions about communism. So what I'd like to do is, in a way, we could offer this as a sort of masterclass in communism, but to kick off with the misconceptions, because I had people over this past year, especially Jennifer Billick, another journalist, who says, why are these people saying this is communism? And that she was sending me links to various tweets, especially sometimes Facebook posts. And I said, it's like that famous quote, there is no there. The political games being played by both the right and the they call themselves the left, but they're not the left. It's neoliberal, which we have to be. For me, I would view neoliberal as on a sphere, on a plane of neoconservatism, actually. But maybe 3 dimensions. We'd have to do some kind of 3-dimensional chart to figure out how this neoliberal class has come out, both in the UK and in the US and many other countries, in Canada and Australia, to sort of overthrow what workings of the left were moving forward. And we've sort of, there are places that you're just like, what the hell? Such as your work that I noticed, I think you penned that pamphlet with your brother on identity politics.
Yeah.
It's just mind-blowing how that has taken over not just the neoliberal left, but parts of the left. There are people who flew into that rage of anger and injustice in the same way that I see people like James Lindsay claiming that anything that's not him is a Marxist. If you're going to follow what Marxism is, well, maybe we could consider library memberships, public library memberships, Marxist. But the problem that I see over time is that much of what the right today, especially since lockdown, is saying, and they seem to be in the States, people like Tucker Carlson. My jaw flew open. I started watching him during lockdown because of all the major media spaces. He was one of the only voices. Now, he's far from a Marxist, but he was the only voice in major media talking about class issues persistently. I don't know if you notice this with other people, but in the same way that you have these kind of behemoth people to hate in the UK, such as when George Galloway won recently, I saw all this uproar over Twitter. And I'm thinking, well, what's going on here? Like, why is his victory bad? The same thing over Gaza. You're a bunch of anti-Semites, and we've ran through the anti-Semitic nonsense. Anti-Semitism is no longer holding water as an excuse. Now people are seeing through that thinly veiled derail tactic, let's call it that. So why are so many reasonably intelligent people, this is Jennifer Billick's question, by the way, calling everything communism that isn't communism, including capitalism, such as James Lindsay, Jordan Peterson, who famously stated, Jordan Peterson, that communism has killed more people than capitalism.
It's an amazing statement, isn't it? I mean, fundamentally, when you look at someone like Jordan Peterson, and I have to give a warning here, I don't watch Jordan Peterson. Mainly, I hear about what Jordan Peterson says from other people telling me things, and I go, oh, he sounds like an idiot. I watched that thing that you sent me. And what I thought was it was just classic demagoguery, right? Demagoguery relies on manipulating the ignorance of your audience and throwing buzzwords around, some things that will appeal to them, saying some things that are true or sound true, and mixing them in with, you know, a bunch of rubbish, and the rubbish sticks to what's true, and you can carry people along. But fundamentally, it's about manipulating your audience. Now, Jordan, I noticed what he did in that little clip you sent me, which was just full from top to bottom of nonsense. He was doing this kind of subtle thing of making his audience feel clever by talking about how stupid are the people who are engaged in what he calls Marxism, but which isn't Marxism, right? So he was saying how, oh, there's some direct correlation between people in academia who study and teach stuff that he's calling Marxism, but which isn't, and being a bit dim, basically. What did he call them? Low verbal intelligence, he says they have. So he's kind of he's manipulating the ignorance of his audience, not stupidity. I don't like that word, but he's manipulating their ignorance, their lack of knowledge of the subject, making them feel like they're with him, they're the verbally intelligent people, and letting them know it's okay to hate these people because they have low verbal intelligence and they're Marxists. And so he's basically correlating low verbal intelligence and Marxism. And he's also describing a bunch of social sciences in bourgeois academia in the West as Marxist. And the fundamental thing right at the heart of that isn't Marxism. And it never would be. The idea that the bourgeoisie in the imperialist countries are going to hire a bunch of professors to teach Marxism to young people is insane if you just stop to think about it for a second. Marxism is the science of the proletariat. It's the science of understanding capitalism, building the organization to overthrow capitalism and replace it with socialism, with a workers' state and a planned economy. That is what Marxism, in a nutshell, that's what Marxism is. The bourgeoisie doesn't teach Marxism, right? And nor do bourgeois institutions. And anybody who's being held up to you as a Marxist in bourgeois academia, especially if what they're teaching is Marxism, is not one, right? It definitely is not Marxism what they're teaching. So that's a kind of number one, I guess, shibboleth that has to be, understood by people, that this is a trick they play on young people, because, many young people have revolutionary feelings. They have a sentiment that something's wrong with society. They have energy and a desire to make things better, to be part of making things better. And they're often attracted to what they are told will be Marxist education because they've understood, or from somewhere or other picked up the idea that Marxism has got something to teach them about what's wrong with the world and how you make it better. Right? That idea is still out there in the ether, right? And this is an idea the ruling class has worked very, very hard to destroy for a very long time. The opening line of the Communist Manifesto, right? Communist Manifesto, written in published in 1848. It was the first document where scientific socialists came together and said, let's explain to people what we are, what communism is, because there's a lot of rumors about what communism is, right? Let's explain to people what communism is, in a succinct style. That's what the Communist Manifesto was, published in 1848. And its first line says, a spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism. And they go on to describe how across Europe, in all the parliaments and all of the public spheres, everybody's accusing everybody else of being a communist. And what this indicates is the ruling classes already, even before the communists are properly organized and have their theory properly worked out, the ruling class is scared of the working class. And it recognizes the communists as the vanguard, as the leading militant edge of the working class, and that their program is a threat to the existence of capitalist exploitation, right? Right all the way back to then, communism was a word that was being bandied about. and everybody was accusing everybody else of communism. And we see very much the same thing now. You know, everybody accusing in the mainstream political sphere, people who don't like things that other people are doing will accuse them of communism, right? And it's a swear word, right? It doesn't have content, does it, when it's used that way? It's just an insult, but it shows you there's a very real fear, and there's also a desire to share that fear with the working class, to make them shy away from the idea of communism and never come in contact with what the substance of communism is. What is Marxism, really? Find out for yourself. No, if we demonize it enough, people will hopefully be kept away from finding out for themselves what it is that Marxism contains, what it has to offer them.
And it's interesting also to see the origins of communism predated Marx, that a lot of people are unaware of how communism as an ideology or as even a practice came to being quite autochthonously. Could you discuss some of the links from even the French Revolution to the Paris Commune, et cetera, et cetera?
Yes, I'm not the best history professor, but, you know, essentially, so ideas of communism were circulating in the working class, communistic ideas, from the beginnings that there was a working class, and even sort of before, really. If you look at every bourgeois revolution, going right back to the English, which was the earliest in the 17th century, it spawned, if listeners might know, it spawned a movement called the Diggers, who were the ultimate egalitarians. And every one of the bourgeois revolutions across Europe after that time also spawned a kind of extreme egalitarian wing. So in the French Revolution, you had what we call the sans culottes. And in each case, what they were doing was taking the slogans under which the bourgeoisie had mobilized them to fight against feudalism to their logical extreme. Because in their fight against feudalism, the bourgeoisie, the rising new class that was carrying out this anti-feudal revolution, was demanding equality of all men. Now, it turned out what they meant was of all men of property before the law, and just men, not women, and not slaves, and not, you know, turns out there was a load of caveats. But the pure principle was one that appealed, of course, to poor people. They joined the fight in many instances against the old order with the idea that we're going through to a real brotherhood of man. Now, that didn't happen, of course, and they were speedily disarmed and disabused of the idea that the revolution was actually for them once the bourgeoisie was firmly in power in each country. But these beginnings of the idea that men are equal and should live in a way where the Diggers had a slogan where they said the earth should be a common treasury for all. Right? They were way ahead of their time. The scientific basis, the productive powers of humanity had not actually developed to the point where that vision was realizable. Britain was still an agrarian society. We weren't industrial. We couldn't have a common treasury for all and have a decent life, right? But those ideas started to develop and circulate amongst working people from the time of the bourgeois revolutions. In Britain, it was, you know, the 1640s. Onwards. In France, it was the 1780s onwards, etc., etc. So these ideas were circulating, as you say, before it was possible for there to be scientifically, objectively, based on modern productive forces, a communist society could be built. Communistic ideas were around. In the early days of Britain's Industrial Revolution and France's Industrial Revolution, when the obvious horrors of the way that poor workers lived in the industrial centres were making themselves felt, and people like Robert Owen, who was the kind of pioneer of experimental socialism, before the science had been worked out, these, what Marx described as utopians, started trying to work out how life could be made fairer. Robert Owens did lots of experiments where he built model villages with schools and much better conditions and pay for his workers. But he sort of, at the end of it, he was like, something isn't right here, because, okay, the workers are much happier and have a much nicer life than they did before, and than they do in other districts. But I'm still getting rich out of this. They don't get rich, but I do. So he couldn't work out scientifically, why was it that even when he paid his workers well, he still got richer and they stayed working class, right? So it's like there's something that the common treasury, the communistic ideal has not been reached here yet through this experiment. And he went off to America and got lost in all kinds of experiments because he was a very genuine guy. He genuinely wanted to understand what's the root of this inequality and horrors in our society and how do we fix them. It took Marx to put all of that onto a scientific footing by doing the work he did on capital. Right? His great scientific opus, Capital, is the work in which he revealed the inner workings of the capitalist system. And that was, again, it didn't come out of nowhere. It was based in, the huge wealth of political economy that had gone before him, but which had always fallen short of truly explaining the roots of the problems in capitalist society and being able to show the contradictions that are at the heart.
Can you speak a bit about the way in which Marx gave us a language, and other Marxists as well, to discuss the kind of alienation that many workers have experienced throughout history, certainly since the Industrial Revolution?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess I see it slightly differently, or would frame it slightly differently, in the sense that I don't see it so much that Marx gave us a language, although of course he did, but he gave us a science for understanding not only the workings of capitalism, but the motive forces of history, human history. And these things are massively powerful because once you start to realize that there are laws operating underneath the surface, you see all these surface phenomena, but underneath the surface confusion of stuff flying around everywhere, there are laws which are operating independent of the will of man. Right, that the capitalist is not just some nasty guy, and if you change him for a nice guy, then everything's going to be nice in society. But the capitalist acts as a personification of his capital. Once you understand things like that, once you understand the logic of production for profit, what the contradictions are that are inherent in that, but what are the driving forces, in a society based on commodity production for profit, then everything is subservient to the need for an accumulated stash of capital to be turned into a bigger stash of capital. That is the driving force of every decision that's taken by every government in the capitalist world, right? And every business person in the capitalist world. That is the driving force. That's what decides everything. And we often try to argue with our governments, with the status quo, with the things that are not right, using human logic. But the problem is that human logic and the logic of capital don't meet. They are two entirely different things. If you want to live in a world where human logic prevails, where you can say, well, that doesn't make sense because people are more important. We need to be taking care of the little children and not throwing their lives away onto the scrap heap before they've even started. Well, if you want to be to live in a world that's responsive, that can respond and react and change itself according to that logic, you have to change the foundations of the society that you live in. Capitalist society is not capable of adapting itself to those things. You talked a little bit about technological development, and if you read Capital, you see that throughout the course of capitalist industrial development, change has been the constant. Disruption to ways of doing things has been constant. The constant drive to renew the means of production in order to win the race of competition, to mechanize so that you have fewer workers to pay. This is one of the contradictions at the heart of the system, because as an individual employer, the fewer workers you have to pay, the more you can produce on economies of scale with a lower wage bill, the more you can put out of business other competitors and monopolize in a field, the more you can win that battle of competition. The problem then comes that by putting loads of workers out of work, what you've done is reduce the base of people who have money to buy your products. And this contradiction is right at the heart of the capitalist system. It creates what Marx described as the crisis of overproduction. The capitalists steer away from this terminology. As you said, Marx gave us a language. It's a scientific language. It's very precise. It describes what happens when the capitalists expand production whilst throwing workers out of work, and they've produced more than can be sold. The markets become glutted. You get a crisis. And crisis, now that capitalism is a global system, crisis is a permanent state of affairs, you know, and it explains to us, as Lenin's work went on to show, how in the era of global monopoly capitalism, you also have permanent war, right? Because the only way for the capitalists to try to save their system from this permanent crisis is to revive markets by conquest of territory and massive looting, by massive destruction that you then have to start rebuilding after you've destroyed everything. And these are ways that the system tries to inject demand when it has created this situation where most of the planet's wealth is in the hands of a tiny number of people, and the masses of the world's people have no ability to be a market for the goods that the capitalist enterprises are producing. So these contradictions are right at the heart. Now, workers have always looked at these disruptions and said, technology is driving me out of work. And they turned their anger on the machines, you know, right from the early days of the Luddites smashing machinery in the early factories. You know, they saw these machines put us out of work, and our work is how we stay alive, you know. And the whole history of capitalism is a history of these kind of violent confrontations and reshapings in the most inhumane way of the labor landscape. But what Marxism shows us is, you know, as far as humanity is concerned and the logic of humanity, once you put these incredible productive powers in the hands of the people as a whole, what you've got is an amazing ability to produce everything we need with very little work, and for people to have a rising standard of living with less and less working time per day, in a very, you know, what could be a very civilized atmosphere, right? So it's not the technology that's the problem. We are made to feel that technology is our enemy because within the bounds of capitalist society, it is. In capitalist societies, every step forwards in terms of technological development is misery for a huge mass of people who are thrown out of work and left in impoverishment. And the capitalists, of course, are not interested in retraining, you know, workers who specialized in some job that they've made obsolete. They'd rather find new people, you know, for the new jobs. You know, new jobs do come around. You know, it has to be said that every revolution has changed the labor landscape. It hasn't made everybody redundant, but capitalism also needs a level of unemployment, and it feeds off that because it's what keeps wages low and very often below actually what are minimum subsistence levels. And it's always the capitalist aim, in order to maximize profit, for wages to be pushed down to absolutely, you know, as rock bottom as possible. I think it's really important when we're looking from all these things from the perspective of the West in the imperialist countries, that we recognize that some of our confusion comes from the strange period we've lived through after World War II. Because capitalism and imperialism had a modification in the post-World War II situation, which was because of the balance of class forces, because of the fact that the communists won the war and defeated fascism on both sides of the world. The communists led the resistance all across Europe. If it wasn't for the USA, imperialism in Europe would have been dead at the end of World War II. The USA was the only imperialist power that survived World War II stronger instead of weaker. In mainland Europe, imperialism was basically gone. Britain was limping heavily, and only the USA was there to, and the USA saved the other imperialist powers in order to save the system of global capitalism. But it did it in a way where they were always, you know, reduced in their status compared to the USA. And the USA was able to kind of prey on the former colonies of the old big imperialist powers for itself to grow very big and strong in the post-war period. But in that situation where communism was knocking at the door all over Europe, and in order to buttress and allow the rebalancing or the revival of imperialism in Western Europe, what happened was a peace deal was struck between the working class and the ruling class of the imperialist countries in Europe. And the peace deal said, you will have a bunch of the things that socialism is going to give you in order not to make revolution. You will let us continue to be exploiters and employers. And imperialists, let's not forget that a huge way for paying for the welfare state of Western Europe was to turn the screws on the colonies and loot them harder. So there was a deal. It's a kind of a devil's pact, but it was also a very short-sighted deal, because what happened was it put the working class, which was very revolutionary and pro-socialist at the end of World War II, it put them to sleep and made them think they didn't need the revolution, and they were going to get to socialism step by step through this social democratic, what's known as the Keynesian consensus. Now, the important thing to understand about the Keynesian consensus is, it's named after John Maynard Keynes, who was the darling economist of the Social Democrats. But this was not something that was granted to the workers by nice progressive social democratic governments in the teeth of the opposition of the conservatives. All representatives of the ruling class, which includes Labour and Tories, and their versions of those in whatever country you live, they were all agreed this was necessary in order to stave off revolution. So France, Germany, Denmark, Britain, Belgium, wherever you were in Western Europe, this deal was made to stop the spread of communism, which was right on the door in Germany, in Italy, in France, in the major powers of Western Europe. And in that situation, people started to become very confused about what is socialist and what is capitalist. They saw these social democratic governments as socialist, as Marxist, as trying to bring socialism. And they saw measures which were nationalising certain key assets and delivering certain social services, the kind of pale imitation of what a real socialist planned economy looks like, as steps towards socialism, as opposed to just, a kind of safety mechanism for the ruling class to restabilize itself and its rule. And what we have seen in the recent period, and it's not an accident that it followed the fall of the USSR, the counter-revolutions in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, that we had already started to enter a period of economic crisis in the West in the 1970s. And it was actually getting quite bad during the 1980s. If you remember, the strikes and the unemployment figures and all the stuff that was happening then, and a lot of unrest, in fact, amongst the working class, because the post-war boom had come to an end and unemployment was back, and problems for working people were starting to come back and reassert themselves. And the ruling class was pushing down and starting to undo some of the gains that the working class had gained. This really gathered a pace with the fall of the Soviet Union, because on the one hand, the threat of communism was no longer hanging over the ruling class. They were triumphal, telling everybody, that's it, communism's over, it's failed, capitalism's the end of history, this is what there is forever. They were very triumphal. But on the other hand, they had a respite from their crisis through an orgy of looting. They looted the wealth of the Soviet people and the former people's democracies of Eastern Europe, absolutely looted them. But the dividends from that were very unequally spread in the imperialist countries. But this is the beginning of the move to, what people call kind of neoliberalism, as opposed to what they look back on as a kind of halcyon era when people were nicer. Essentially, you're looking at the end of the Keynesian consensus and the re-establishment of imperialism as it really is. So what we've seen in this period since the collapse of the Soviet Union is, okay, there was a shot in the arm for the imperialists for a while. Profitability came back as they looted, the former socialist countries' wealth. But that only lasts so long. Once that was over, the crisis reasserted itself globally, but now the imperialists are allowing the system to return, or kind of forced to allow the system to return to its natural state of affairs, which is that if we look back to the imperialist countries before World War II, you can remember, or you've seen the pictures and know the stories about how, okay, a section of the working class in the imperialist countries had a relatively privileged existence, but the mass of the workers, even in the rich imperialist countries, lived terrible lives. And that's what we are returning to now. And it's a shock to people in the West because they thought the gains they'd made were forever. It turns out they were just a temporary sop. It was a peace deal to quiet us down, disarm us, decapitate our leadership, remove our class consciousness. And now when it comes to fighting back, people are totally confused because, of course, the really tragic part in all of this story is that communist parties, following the rise of Khrushchev in the Soviet Union and, going along with this Keynesian situation that we had in the West, the social democratic consensus in the imperialist countries, they started very early on. Britain, in 1951, the British Communist Party published a book called The British Road to Socialism, in which they basically said, oh, now there's no need for revolution anymore. We'll all have peaceful coexistence between imperialism and socialist countries. And we are going to just put pressure on Labour governments. And in that way, we will go step by step peacefully into socialism. It was a total lie, and it demobilized the working class, and they lost their understanding of what the system is. People stopped properly studying Marxism, Marx, Lenin, understanding the system and understanding that the only way out of this is to fully abolish capitalism and replace it with planned production, with the workers in control. These truths were all lost sight of. And this spectrum that we talk about, right, left, we've grown up in a tradition where left meant people who sort of presented themselves as being a bit socialist, right? And now they're so obviously not, it's embarrassing. But
every time people say I'm a leftist, or that, who's that I'm putting it in air quotes, journalist, oh, what's her name? I'm a Marxist, damn it. That's the famous quote.
Oh, yeah, I'm a communist, goddammit. Yes,
that's it.
Ash Sarkar.
That's it.
These fakers, these utter fakers. Left and right has always in the imperialist countries, a left and right on the bourgeois political spectrum. The extreme left is the Trotskyites, who are just the left wing of the Labour Party, and the Labour Party has always been an imperialist party. My party has lots of books on, explaining the history of Labour and why it was never a socialist party. It was never a real workers' party. It's not your membership. It's not whether your members are working class that makes you a workers' party. It's whether your programme and your outlook is to implement things which are in the interests of the working class. And what that actually means is, are you going to fight for socialism? Because if you're just saying how I will run capitalism in a more nice way, that is not socialist. But we've been taught to confuse those terms. We've been taught that socialism and communism are different things, and a socialist is basically someone who wants capitalism with kinder characteristics, while a communist is someone who's a bit scary and wants the revolution. Whereas in fact, there actually is no difference between a socialist and a communist in the scientific sense. They're the same people, right? Socialism is the name given to the lowest stage of communism. That's all. So if you're a real socialist, you're someone who wants to abolish capitalism. We just bastardized this term for so many decades that people don't understand that. The left was always imperialist aligned. But the social and economic climate in which it operated changed. And so now what we're seeing is the true colours that were always there. The substance of the policy of the Labour Party actually is no different than it's always been. It's just the wider environment and the needs of the ruling class have shifted as, the changes in national and international forces have shifted.
Well, I'd like to get to the Labour Party in a little bit, and especially to discuss Corbyn, his party and Momentum's links to spawning some of the most noxious nonsense I've heard of in my lifetime, the gender nonsense. At the same time, I'm sharing these months articles by Owen Jones on Gaza, because on Gaza, he's correct. And no, men have penises and women do not. We're at this very bizarre, who would have thought that Labour politics would have become so divisive over the idea that we are not clownfish. So I'm just bracketing that for now because I wanted to quickly get back to this idea, though, that you were discussing earlier about these kinds of collapses that we've been witnessing since the 90s for sure. Some would argue as far back as Reagan and Thatcher, where the left and right began to, let's just say, shift positions radically, such that we had Clinton in the US, and then in your corner, Blair, being born of these ostensibly left of center parties, but that bring forth more political rhetoric that reminds me of, well, when I was living in England, I met Brian Barnes. I've interviewed him. It's a print interview. And he's one of the most important muralists in the UK. And he did the wall in Battersea way back. Of course, that's been destroyed because the entire part of London, as many other parts, have become gentrified. As Thatcher turned what was in 1978, don't kill me if I've got the numbers wrong, but I'm remembering back to a piece I wrote years ago. I think in 1978, 48% of all housing in Britain was council housing. And today, that number is in the single digits. I mean, Thatcher destroyed housing by offering, and this is my reading, feel free to disagree, by offering those who were, I think, neoliberals in a shell about to come out, the possibility of owning your own home. She sold them the American dream, ironically, shifted populists towards her. Meanwhile, actual working class issues were really under the grind from being ignored, and those who did pay attention didn't have the political traction necessarily. And I guess we can speak to the closures of the mines and what happened in Northern England and Wales. Could you discuss this in terms of maybe what's going on today? Because you also mentioned something earlier that's very important. I've been telling people this for a decade more, we're entering into neo-feudalism. Open your eyes. Who got richer during lockdown? It should never have been the case. In fact, if I had been dictator of the universe, I love to say this all the time, but if I were a dictator of the universe, I would have made every single company that made a profit share it in the public purse. Anyways, not going to be dictator. Could you discuss how the kinds of manifestations that went on even during, let's say, 3 periods, the Industrial Revolution, Thatcher's Britain, and then today, in terms of workers' rights and the importance of communism?
That's a big question.
A lot of our listeners are coming out of this with what we get in the United States. I'm quoting Ronald Reagan, excuse me if I might get a few words wrong. But when the Sandinistas were running to gain power in Nicaragua, he said, Managua, Nicaragua is only a 1-day drive from Laredo, Texas. Okay? Now, this says it all because it was a complete imitation, almost mocking, because we can read it like that years later, of the Red Scare. This is the fear of the wealthy that they hold about the working classes.
Absolutely. And one of the things I think that becomes clearer and clearer when you watch the propaganda of the West today, and you see, if you have the ability to see the truth and see their propaganda, you see how much of their propaganda is projection. They are degenerate, and they project their degenerate mentality onto their enemies and claim that terrible, horrible things are going to be done to you by communists and communist countries and progressive countries. And the things they dream up are so twisted and warped and horrible, but they come from their own twisted, warped, horrible minds because, they're presiding over a totally degenerating system. And we see that in sphere after sphere, the way that they project their crimes onto their opponents and then scare the working class by describing the crimes that their opponents are not committing. And the reason that many people in the West buy into it is, of course, we have experience of evil rulers committing horrible crimes. So we can be scared with that. But the thing is, what they're describing to us is what we actually live under. It's not the crimes. They're trying to tell us what you have, cling on to it, because what's coming is worse. And of course, that's not true. It's entirely the opposite. But this projection thing, you're right to identify it. It's kind of can feel quite surreal once you've clocked onto it, like how totally reversed the truth is from what they are constantly telling us. You're talking about sort of the situation for workers in these different periods. You know, the situation of the Industrial Revolution is brilliantly documented by Marx in Capital, and there are huge sections in that book where he goes into great detail of, you know, the factory inspectors' reports and the children's inspectors' reports and all of the, you know, horrific conditions being endured by the industrial workforce, or any type of labour force during these centuries of the development of capitalism in Britain, and how, you know, what you get from reading Capital, because he amasses all this evidence and shows the process by which workers started to organize and demand their rights, and they were able to use the kind of splits in the ruling class, who were kind of split between kind of the remnants of the landed aristocracy, who were capitalist farmers by that point. They were a bourgeoisie, but they were on the land, and the industrialist merchants and merchants and industrialists in the towns, and how the split in interests between those groups was able to be used by the workers in different situations to get rights for themselves, but also how it was almost forced on the ruling class that in order to preserve any working class at all, they were using up the lives of workers so fast, they could only keep industry going by a constant influx of new labor from the countryside. You know, the new ones who were being born weren't being born quick enough. They were being used up so quickly. You know, lives were thrown away. Life was so short and brutal under industrial sway, that they constantly need this influx of new, fresh, healthy stock from the countryside. But even that was draining too fast. So they needed legislation to stop the worst excesses of the factory owners, because without legislation, the drive to suck work out of the laborers, even to the extent of using up the laborer's lifetime in 3 times as quickly as you should do, you know, nothing stopped them, because there's always the fear that the guy, if you're not doing it, the guy down the road's doing it, and he'll undercut you and put you out of business. You know, there was, when the first factory acts were introduced in the middle of the 19th century, and there was a lot of complaint because it only applied to certain industries or certain sizes of workshop or certain size of factory, and the factory owners would say, but if I can only employ my girls for 12 hours, after work they'll go down the road and do a few more hours at that little workshop, and that guy's getting, that's not fair. That guy's getting labor out of my staff. They should be working for me, and that, you know, he's getting extra work, extra profit, and I can't get that profit. So there was, without the restraining hand of legislation, it was impossible to regulate something that even the capitalists were starting to see was a bit unhelpful. And, you know, the state of their workers was in many ways detrimental to their profits. Because actually, and we see this even today, Julian, you must have seen the discussions about what happens if you go from a 5-day week to a 4-day week, and actually you can be just as productive, sometimes more productive, because you're in a better state, less stressed, right?
Oh, absolutely.
There were similar things found when they introduced the Factory Acts. There were rules about how young people could be, and young people who worked in factories could only do certain hours and had to have some education, and women shouldn't be employed for so many hours, and hygiene regulations were introduced, all this stuff that had never existed before. And of course, it actually boosted profitability, but it was impossible to do without doing it kind of across the whole of production. But it needed legislation. And at the same time, Marx points out that the enforcement regime was pathetic, totally underfunded and tiny. And, you know, so there was this constant, because of the pushback, of course, of the employers. On the one hand, as a class, they sort of realized that they need some kind of restraint, and it has to be through legislation, because it has to apply to everybody equally, and you can't have this fear that the guy down the road is doing it and you're not. But, you know, equally, the pushback against, you know, oh, this costs too much, it's too difficult, or, you know, essentially resulted in an almost invisible, pathetic, you know, unworkable oversight regime, which we also have that problem today, right? You know, Marx talks about, he cites some report where they talk about mines, and he says there's this many thousand mines and this many, like 8 inspectors or something, and one of them's like 70. And he said each mine can be visited once every 10 years. So who knows what the hell's actually going on and whether the rules are being enforced or not. So, you know, the balance of class forces under capitalism is always in the interest of the capitalist, who own not only the employers, but they are the controllers of the government, right? So everything is always, the deck is always stacked. And the longer that capitalism exists for historically, the more stacked it becomes, because the wealth becomes more and more concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. And so the power of those owners of these huge fortunes becomes so immense that no government has any power in the face of it. You know, this monopoly capitalism, we see it today, you know, which is so enormous in its weight, in its gravitational pull, and its influence and control over every aspect of political and economic life in the capitalist countries. You know, it's utterly inescapable, and politicians are just mandarins and clowns in the service of big capital. You know, the idea that, you know, oh, we vote and we get people who are going to run the system differently has become painfully, obviously ridiculous at this point in time. So then we go on to the kind of Thatcher period, and we're looking at a time when, okay, so as I described earlier, there had been this peace deal, right, and the Keynesian consensus and the welfare state, and people got used to the idea that they had a right to certain things, a right to free education, all the way through, including university, right? A right to a home, a right to a job. And if you can't have a job, a right to be paid benefits that will keep you at a decent level of existence, right? A right to dignity, a right to culture, a right to access to the law. That's what legal aid was, right? Access to the courts. So all of these rights, we got used to the idea, in, you know, the workers in the West, that we had them, that they were permanently ours, and that this is the minimum we should expect from a life under capitalism. And of course, that came to an end because the capitalist crisis reasserted itself globally after the post-war boom of reconstruction had ended. Suddenly, there's not so many jobs. Suddenly, there's not such a big market. Everything starts glutting and contracting again. And two things happen. One is there's a demand that the pay, the conditions, the pensions of the workers should be reduced. Another is that the social spending on the workers should be cut. And a third is that all the services that are being run by the state without the intervention of any private capital should be privatized, because they are untapped opportunities for profit taking. In an era where profitability is now in crisis because the world markets are glutted, where do we turn to make more profit? So there's 3 ways you make more profit. One is you cannibalize the economy, as people call it. You know, you make everything, you privatize everything, and you turn it into something that someone's making a profit out of. One is, you know, the classic ways to rinse more money as a capitalist are extend the working day, intensify labor, you know, the labor process, or mechanize so that more of the laborer's time in each day is given to you for free. Right? The amount of time the worker spends actually paying back his means of subsistence, what it costs to keep him alive, his wages, becomes smaller and smaller as a proportion of his day's work. And the rest of the day's work is surplus labor that goes to the capitalist. So these are the ways in which the capitalism pushes to rinse more profit out of the system. But Thatcher, essentially, her job was to front up for the system as the ruling class changed its strategy. So it changed from the post-war Keynesian welfare state focus, in which, let's not forget, the Tories used to vie with Labour and compete over who was building the most council houses. right? It wasn't that Tories were always opposed to everything. You know, we are given this stupid myth that goes, Tories nasty, Labour nice. Tories for the bosses, Labour for the workers. Labour wants to give you the welfare state, and the only thing that stops it is mean Tories. Tories just want to take everything away from you. And this is a nonsense. You know?
Statistically, in the US, today, the working class is more represented. They're registered Republicans, not Democrats. Democrats are the elite neoliberal class.
Right. So the idea that, you know, that one side is on you, the fundamental thing to recognize is both of the main parties, all of the main parties represent the same interests. They do it with different wrapping, different branding, you know, different emphases in their language. But fundamentally, you know, it's what's various ways of describing it, Tweedledum and Tweedledee. What does George Galloway like to say? Two cheeks of the same backside. They represent the same thing. They all work for the imperialist ruling class, and they all have the same fundamental one-point program, which is, what in Britain, save British imperialism. In America, save US imperialism, right? That is their focus. And the question is, how do they do it? So Thatcher's job was to come in and start dismantling the welfare state. And there were various kind of divide and rule tactics they used in that period. So, for example, when they were selling things off, they tried to make the workers feel they were going to gain from that. And a few workers did in the short term. Long term, of course, we've all lost out. But even at the time of the right to buy, you know, there's something really important people have to understand about right to buy. The right to buy your council home could be rebranded as the abolition of your right to a home. Because as soon as you sell off council housing, you're saying you might end up homeless. We no longer have, you've torn up every local council's commitment to making sure the people who live in their area are housed. They can't do it if they don't own
Excellent perspective. Excellent.
They can't, can they? They can't. No. So that is what that was. They called it right to buy, and it sounds like they're being kind to you. They abolished the right to a home at a stroke. And I remember the first victims of that in 1988, I think, 87, 88. I was the same age as the kids who were the first victims of this, because they were 15, 16-year-old kids who came out of the care system and who found that they didn't have a home to go to. So Britain's first homeless were teenagers who'd come out of care. And suddenly, I remember watching a documentary, you know, being 15, 16 years old, watching a documentary and being so shocked and appalled and moved by the plight of these kids with no one to take care of them and nowhere to live, and being preyed on by drug dealers and pimps and all the rest of it. So it stuck in my mind very strongly, because I'd grown up in a world where we didn't have homeless people. Now my kids have grown up in a world where homeless people are totally normalized, and we walk past them like this, you know, like it's just part of life.
And we're taught to fear them than it is they who should fear us. You know, this was what Thatcher's right to buy did, is to say, okay, anyone who has some capital can go to the front of the line. And those of you in the flats, tant pis.
They robbed us of our humanity.
I actually think there should be a movement. I'm sorry, but I actually stopped dating someone over this issue in London, because I was a bit, I try not to be, I know I had inner wokeness, but in this, I don't feel woke. It deeply disturbs me that the way that people get ahead is by knocking others out of the queue. When we go to school, we learn in kindergarten, first, second year, we learn about respect and that queues are important. The problem is who gets to the front of the queue with Thatcher were those who opposed her in theory, but they could be bought out. You know, and it's just, as you said, I love your perspective, that it puts people in fear, and it demonstrates that people have fear of being homeless because the mandates by their elected leaders, locally, nationally, has failed.
Totally. So, you know, Thatcher was in charge of this phase of post-war history. It was not about her. She was a front person for the ruling class, which changed its tack because of the economic situation it was in. So, and we saw this across, again, we call it Thatcherism, but we saw it across the West, didn't we? It was a response of the global capitalist rulers in each country when the global capitalist economy started to swing into crisis and deeper into crisis through the 80s. And we should not forget that we would have been in a revolutionary situation a hell of a lot sooner if it hadn't been for the fall of the Soviet Union, because that looting, the orgy of looting which followed that, revived the flagging capitalist global economy for 10, 20 years. And that was at the expense of all the people. But, so anyway, we're talking about Thatcher, the right to buy. You were talking about that, how it makes us feel. And with the contradictory messages we get under capitalism, the reality is when you live in a system that's based on competition, you can't help imbibing this idea that life is a competition, right? What the competition of life is what the better off workers, we call them middle class, right? But they're privileged workers in the West. They try to keep their children in the same bracket of privileged workers by giving them legs up on the rungs of the ladder, by helping them have a head start in the competition of life, making sure they get a decent education and out of school activities and, develop so they can get to the right university, and the right university will get you to the right job, and the right job, the right network, you'll be able to have a house and a family at the right level, etc., etc. The competition of life is drilled into us because we live under capitalism. Where everything is based on competition. In capitalism, the workers are in competition with one another for jobs. The capitalists are in competition with one another for markets and shares of the market. The workers and the capitalists are in competition with one another for how the wealth that the workers have produced is divided, how much of the wealth ends up in the hands of the workers and how much goes to make profit for the capitalists, which these two things are exactly related, right? The more that the workers get, the lower the rate of profit is. The less the workers get, the higher the rate of profit is. So that competition is also, there's what Marx called it a three-sided triangle of competition, again, is baked into the center of our life in this system. So of course, it's not surprising we end up imbibing the idea that it's somehow human nature to be just competitive all the time and to get ahead by elbowing out of line your fellows. My answer to that is always just to step back and say, well, who is there who feels happy when they get ahead at the expense of other people? The reality is that is how this world works. And there's a reason why the people at the top of the pile very often, or the people who get paid a huge amount by the real rulers of the world for fronting for their system, all seem to be so flipping sociopathic. It's like, on the one hand, this society breeds and rewards sociopathy. And on the other hand, you've got to have a certain sociopathic mentality to want to climb the top of that pole and enjoy being up there and feeling like you've made it at the expense of all these bloody idiots, but it's not natural and it's not normal. It's not intrinsic to human. I don't think there's anything permanent about this state of affairs. As soon as you change the environment that people are in, you will see very different sides of what we think of as human nature. And this thing that we're all selfish and competitive and it's just built into us is a reflection of the conditions in which we live. It's not a reflection of our intrinsic nature.
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. And that's why I think the left-right shift is so important to understand. It's completely fragmented, because when Trump won the presidency, I saw Trump derangement syndrome happening before it happened. People in the run-up to his running for president were freaked out. It started then. This reality TV show. Well, Berlusconi sang on a cruise ship, right? That was one of his jobs. So what? I mean, we can do better than ad hominem. Let's look at this. And I told my friends, I said, this is the first time in our lifetime. And how do I know without asking you your age? Because it's the first time really since 1898 that the US has not intervened in one form or another militarily in some part of the world. And this has a knock-on effect because you're discussing the means of production and consumption, and also consumption in terms of what you just mentioned. People are taught to, oh, but this costs 30p less. Why does it cost 30p less? And I talk to people about price differences. And are you aware of the conditions of factory workers? They think I'm nuts. I go into even, there's this Via della Spiga in Milano that years ago I used to go to when I was often in Milan, just to use it as my tour of haute couture. And it was lovely. I mostly never bought anything, one thing, and once. But the reality is that I also tell people, I said, maybe we should be buying stuff. Like I know seamstresses 20 kilometers from where I'm sitting who in the 90s were sewing on sequins for Prada. That gives local work in a real life condition that people are out, like right now, it's beautiful and they're sewing sequins while watching their grandchildren. It's fascinating, the anthropology of the kind of work that these haute couture houses could and are, some of them are in many ways, but they've transformed even since the 90s. And then we skip over to how Trump is perceived now. People were just so flipped out, and I said, I would vote for Trump if I lived in any country but ours. We are propagandized to think he's evil, his orange hair and flowers and whatever. But are we going to do comparative who's creepy? Do I need to list the ways in which Joe Biden has said and done creepy things to women and girls? So I think we need to maybe dispense with that and start thinking about why the rest of the world likes Trump. Well, it's simple. And I tell people that we're not most of the world. The West is a tinier percentage than the rest of the world's what is called today the global South. I really don't like that title. What used to be called the third world, I don't like that. My friends in Bogota, we call it il cuarto mondo. Okay, not the reference to the Diamela El Tit novel, but il cuarto mondo I love because it represents another dimension, not this first, second, third. There is no third, so there is no. But the thing is here, why is it that people love him and he has not caused a new theater of war? And to me, that means a lot, even if I'm not necessarily from Somalia or Yemen. But those people know what it's like to deal with our votes. And I tell my friends that all the time. And when Obama was running, I remember saying, no, I'm not voting for, what, you're a racist? I swear to God, a person I know who is a racist said this to me. And I'm like, no. And I started to point out some of the things he had said. Obama experimented early on with Skype rooms. And so I was one of 10 people in a room who were talking to him via Skype when he was doing his campaign. Remember, he was made famous, not only because he was massively funded by the Pritzkers for a position he would otherwise never had the opportunity to do. And he was positioned as this kind of, well, look at his motto.
Hopey changey.
Yes. Hope he change. I like that. And so I think what we need to learn is that this is a disguise. And then my friends, they went from that to the racist thing and they did this. What about gay marriage? And I would say to them, my right to get married to someone is so way down the rung of priority. I mean, I can't even tell you how far low it might be beyond my desire to even get fake nails. So, I mean, I don't care. And I'm not saying that for the people that cares, I'm poo-pooing them. I'm not doing, but let's just talk frankly, because I'm so sick of it ever since the trans women are women debate. It's like, oh, let's talk normally. I miss the 90s just for that. So how about we agree that our vote shouldn't end in people whose lives we'll probably never know and bomb the shit out of those places. Let's just agree there. And I'll never get married to a woman. Thank you very much. Take a bow. But the thing is this pissed off so many people. I'll never, ever, ever forget it. Never. Since then, I knew that neoliberalism has started to do its damage. We didn't see the damage in the 80s of Reagan and Thatcher. It happened far later.
You've pinpointed a whole bunch of things and how they all sort of come together in this new period where the communist movement had sort of disappeared from view entirely in the West, right? That, it'd been on a downward slide since Khrushchev and the revisionism in the 50s, and then it just was decimated and in disarray after the fall of the Soviet Union. And during the 60s, 70s, 80s, we'd been having this shift of the women's struggle and the struggle against racism out of the streets and into the universities. And they became academic disciplines in bourgeois academia. And these are actually the roots, bourgeois feminism, that says the women's struggle is a struggle between women and men, not between workers and capitalists, right? Not between oppressed and oppressor. That the women's question, which was so brilliantly explained in the classic work by Friedrich Engels, The Origins of the Family, Private Property and the State, which
Best book ever.
Best book ever, absolutely. And I will be forever thankful to my mother who put it in my Christmas stocking when I was 15. And it changed my life, right? It changed my life. And as a woman, you read that book and you go, oh my God, thank fuck. Okay? Because then you understand.
Yeah.
And once you've understood, you can put this question in its historical context and understand that the solution to the oppression of women is the end of exploiting societies, right? So, okay,
exactly.
It's a class question, because the only way we're going to get the end of exploiting societies is with the victory of the working class over capitalism, right? And turning that into a bourgeois feminist line where men are your enemy, underwear is your enemy, all kinds of things are your enemy except for class society, was a horrible trick to have played on the working class. And one of the worst things is, because the communist movement was in decline through this period, my comrades were very active in the women's movement of the 60s and 70s, and we have a wonderful book that documents their struggles to try to bring a Marxist line into that movement. And what you'll see from that is not only the Trotskyite fake revolutionaries, but even the revisionist communists jumped on the feminist bandwagon and amplified all kinds of stupid feminist demands and failed at the job of helping to keep the working class women mobilized in that movement, and instead helped to demobilize the working class movement and turn this into something that ended up, as I said, in the universities as a bourgeois academic discipline of, women's studies, feminism, all this bullshit, right? And they did the same with the anti-racist struggle, which again, my father and his comrades were very deeply involved in through the 70s and the 80s. And it ended up in this kind of oppression hierarchy, nonsense. And it ended up as race studies and blah, blah in the universities. And it ended up as a thing where you, instead of realizing and recognizing and bringing the understanding to the working class that the struggle against racism is actually a struggle against imperialism, because imperialism is what needs racism to justify its wars and to keep the population at home divided and mobilized in support of the wars, right? So you have to demonize all these other people around the world. And, the first victims of imperialist racism were the Irish. Got nothing to do with blackness, but we constantly have ourselves hit over the head that, the blacker you are, the more oppressed you are. It's, utter nonsense.
Silly. You go to Morocco, the Berbers, who are oppressed, are lighter skin, fair hair color.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And it's also interesting to note the crossover, because people are like, but we've changed so much since the medieval era. And I say, no. The kings and their mates from Eton and so forth, the Bullingdon Club, they've all become cronies in government, in the private sector. The landowners maintain some kind of transfer to the middle class. And then you have the rest. And today we're heading back there. We're heading back to the feudal state, the manor. And I think people are so unaware of this. I'll give you an example. I loved it when you criticized feminism earlier, because it's interesting how in 2018 there was a celebration amongst many of the women involved in the gender debate to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the right to vote. I refused. One of them said, why? And I said, because the Representation of the People Act 1918 only applied to women over the age of 30 who owned a property. Yes. I said, I'm not celebrating that. And I don't think it's a good look for anyone to celebrate that. In fact, that was a bad thing. I'm very Three Musketeers in this way. We need to go with 1928 with the Equal Franchise Act and I had women very upset with me, but I do see that example exactly pinpoints the problems with some feminists to see class, because also who can afford to be a feminist? And I'm talking about, I've done a book dealing with the madres and abuelos, more so the abuelos de la Plaza de Mayo. And these were the grandmothers that raised their deceased, assassinated child's child, their grandchild, while their daughter was tossed out of a plane into the river running around Buenos Aires, for instance, or in the Atlantic. So you have these cases where the more revolutionary acts are happening by middle-aged women and grandmothers. And you won't see that so much here. Look at what just happened in Mexico. I mean, the fact is that you have, and when I read the merging of the parties, my eyeballs flew around in the orbits to see the PRI having made alliance with PAN. I'm just like, where am I? So when we start to look at how class and all these other politics don't really mesh together, because in a way, I think what you're saying, and I think it's what I'm saying in general, is that class is the basic entry to having discussion about equality above and all everything else.
100%. And that's why the trick of identity politics has been to remove class, the understanding of class, from these demands, which are working class demands. It's a working class demand that we should abolish racism. It's a working class demand that we should abolish the oppression of women. And these were always part of the communist, the socialist program for a new society. And they were good ways of uniting the working class to fight against its common enemy, to show the women, look, this extra oppression that you suffer is real under class society. It won't be got rid of until we get rid of class society. So join with us together in the struggle for socialism. The same you say to the black workers, the white workers. Yes, there's an extra level of oppression on minorities of various types, whether they're, black or whatever they might be, that comes because of imperialism. And the only way to get rid of it is to abolish imperialism. So let's fight together. Let's unify our struggles and fight the common enemy in order to build a life that's really civilized and where we can have real equality. Equality is not possible in a system that is by its nature unequal. It has inequality baked into the central premise of how it works. Every day that one, just look at a little nugget of one worker working for one boss. During one day's productive labor, the worker is paid enough to keep him alive, but he produces extra wealth above and beyond what it costs to keep him alive. That goes to the capitalist. The next day, the same thing happens. So with every single day, the gap in how much the worker has and how much the capitalist has gets bigger. The worker stays on a, imagining all other things being equal in a nice world, the worker's flatlining. And every single day, because of the worker's work, the capitalist is getting richer. So the idea that it is possible to have equality in a world that's characterized by masses of impoverished workers and a few, multi-billionaires is insanity. Right? And you can't, it's stupid to take as your starting point this system of production and say, let's make it fair, let's make it equal. What you have to understand is why it isn't, why it can't be, and then what we have to do about it. And of course, the whole function of identity politics is to stop us understanding those things, to co-opt our demands and our program, which people have recognized since the October Revolution in the Soviet Union, or in Russia that became the Soviet Union, since that time, since October 1917, when they enacted a socialist program, and in the process they abolished the oppression of women, they abolished racism and the exploitation of nations by nations and men by men and all the rest of it, and showed what it's possible to do when you put the modern productive forces in the hands of the working class. Because of that, the battle for public opinion was won fundamentally and historically, was won in practice by the working class, by the socialist and communist camp. And so the imperialists have been on the back foot since then. They used to tell us before World War I, before the triumph of the October Revolution and the building of socialism in the USSR, they used to tell us that it was natural for men to control women because women were weak in their minds, weak in their bodies. They're like little children, they need to be controlled. That was their open philosophy. After the Soviet Union disproved all of that, they had to go back and make a new program where they pretend to be the upholders of rights for women. Same thing happened with racism. Soviet Union showed that all the races can live together. They showed that the peoples who were described as backwards and savages can embrace new technology and new productive forces and culture just as quickly as anybody else. And, you know, in areas where the people had been nomads with, you know, no technology, within 10 years they had, you know, education systems, modern productive forces, all kinds of things, and all done without, you know, destroying their culture or their civilizations or anything else. So, you know, the Soviet Union proved in practice that racism is not inevitable, that sexism and oppression of women and other peoples is not inevitable. And so the ruling class has really been on the back foot since then, trying to repackage itself. And part of this, their kind of retroactive action has been the introduction into our movement and into the space from which the communists were retreating, where communists were no longer bringing a strong class conscious education to the advanced workers in each country. This space was filled by bourgeois identity politics, and it festered away in the universities for a long time. And when it really burst forth, you know, this whole sort of, it seemed to a lot of us who hadn't been in the universities, like this trans thing kind of came out of nowhere. Like, what the hell was that? Where did that come from? You know, but it's a kind of
psyops.
Right, but it you know, it's a combination of a lot of factors, isn't it? But the groundwork had been being laid through the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s in the universities, and for all that many of the Black studies people and the women's studies people hate it, because of course, as soon as the trans ideology comes, you can what if you can self-identify as a man or a woman, can you also self-identify as black or white? You know, it throws a cart and horses right through or into the setup of their little kingdoms. And you know, so the identity politics people, many of them actually really don't like the trans ideology, although in fact it is an extension of what they've been doing for years. You know, this peddling of that you are what you look like, you are what you feel like, you know, you are what you are your sort of biological, I don't know, your skin color, your gender kind of defines you in some very absolute way. You know, they set that whole thing up, didn't they? And then they're upset that it comes back to bite them. But you know, of course, the other aspect of the trans thing is that it's a massive marketing campaign, isn't it? A massive marketing campaign for experimental, unproven, in fact, well, proven to be hideously harmful, but you know, treatments that are very, very expensive but very profitable, but only apply to an incredibly tiny number of people in reality.
Meanwhile, women who want to have breast reduction because of serious need to have this surgery to save their spinal cords, even their backs, cannot get this on the NHS or in many, many countries where there is socialized medicine. So I call the trans movement a political clown car. You know how the clown car comes out between each act in the circus? Yeah, so you don't see all the people in the background getting up the new trampoline. And we're supposed to focus on this, and we're distracted. This is why. I mean, were you alarmed? I was alarmed by how freaking quickly people bought into the anti-Russia narrative after Ukraine, and how ignorant, I do mean that word ignorant, not knowing the history. The war wasn't started with Russia 2 years ago. It was much more than that. In fact, it was orchestrated back to the Maidan Revolution, 2013-14, Nuland, our huge hand with Nuland and her husband, all in that area of the world. And you saw this happening in Cairo 15 years prior, and in Beirut as well. I mean, the USAID I'm referring to, they meddle into parts of the world and create, that's why when you go to Delhi, I had a job interview there, lovely private university, they were all about gender ideology, and there's a reason for that. I'm talking about the upper 1% of Delhi goes to this university that would go to this university. These are billionaires' kids. In fact, Americans have no idea about this kind of wealth because it is now so pervasive amongst that small tranche of population in India, meanwhile, a much larger populace, right?
Yeah. So, there's a whole bunch of things that we could go into there, and the things you're bringing up. I think on one side, we've got to see that in this situation we're in now, where global capitalist economic crisis is reasserting itself, we have to see that the strategy of our rulers is to get us involved in culture wars, to fight one another, to blame one another for our problems, to the kind of false dichotomies we're presented with. Are you, the dichotomy we're given on the trans question, for example, is, are you a transphobe, or do you so you have to like hate the trannies,
or are you enlightened?
Yeah, right. Hate the trannies or love them, right?
Yeah,
but that's actually not the question, is it? Like the question is, why is this?
Are you compliant?
Right. Why is this ideology being promoted? So, and the whole hate the trannies thing is it's the wrong response, isn't it, to something that you've seen is wrong? Because what you're saying there is despise the victims, a lot of them are just alienated kids, right? Suffering mental illness on a mass social scale. You can't blame them as individuals. It's the social phenomenon, right? When it's so widespread, when there are so many people suffering the same mental illness at the same time, you've got to blame society and not the individuals, right? They are victims, and their pain, I don't doubt, is utterly real, right? They're being groomed and preyed upon by a broken society and a medical industrial complex that can make a shitload of money out of breaking them further and then selling them a pill, right? Lying to them about what these treatments are going to do for them so they can make money, and then putting a massive lobby campaign together to say these treatments should be free, and it's transphobic to not grant immediate mastectomies to every 15-year-old girl who asks for them. I mean, I'm sure in 100 years' time, people will look back at the hysteria around this, the demands, the medical experimentation that's going on young working class kids, and be horrified, absolutely horrified. And that conversation's not allowed to be had because it's been turned into nice or nasty. Are you an evil hater? Are you an evil hater of the transvestites or the trans people, or are you a lover and supporter and a groomer? But that's what they do. You have to be one or the other, and it's like I choose neither, please. I choose to create a world in which our young people are not made mentally ill by the conditions of their development. How about that?
Yeah. And when we're not turned into robots to fund, well, what's the other side of this? Because at the beginning of this year, the Minister of Labour in the Dominican Republic introduced a 6-month, it's a pilot program that is also being tested in certain parts of the UK, of running a 36-hour work week. You talked about the 3-point tier of what's being offered in some of these economic pacts with the devil. But we're given some of these pacts we have no choice in, because just like I said earlier, you vote for certain people in the States and that results in perpetual war again. And such is the case with what's going on in Gaza and since 7 October, and as well what's been going on in Ukraine under the guise of Russia, the evil Russia. Yet, I bet most Americans, and I'm not being rude here, but I've taught in higher education and all over North America, especially New York, I think a lot of Americans did not even know 1/10 of what Vladimir Putin was talking about when he gave a very excellent history lesson. Now, I say this not to shame people who are victims of American education. I say this because we've been brainwashed. Yeah. It's one of the first things I thought when I got into the West Bank as well. As soon as I went through my first Marxism, that's 2 houses at certain distances, you never know, bulldozed, car stops. It's a taxi. It sounds fancy, but it's not. You pay taxis, you get to the Marxism, you walk around or through the damaged building. First you have the treat of the IDF. If you're lucky, they do not put their weapon to you directly. I've had this happen. I got out of a car where we were in going to Damascus, I believe. We were Jericho. We were very high up altitude on a ridge for 2 hours. And I was like, what's going on? So I thought, I'll go, stupid me, I'll get out. I think they use M16s, they're US supplied, so it would have been that pointed my way. We're funding this great three-tiered scheme in a way where you're talking about consumers, laborers, and the owners, and the way this deal with the devil functions. We have it again. We're funding wars, the war by proxy with Russia, of course, Ukraine. I mean, they're really in a political difficulty now, and they're going to lose part of their country to Russia. They shouldn't have listened to Newland. I'm sorry to say this, and my heart goes out to everyone who's died in these places, but these are political chessboards. Skip over to Gaza and the West Bank, and now, for the first time in my lifetime, I'm seeing, as a conscious human, I should say, I'm seeing real pushback by the world's people, and yes, we even run stories about the university students fighting back in the States. It's very surprising that this is going on. But the way that even that is being rebranded by major media, and the way that the blacklists have started again. So we saw right around October of last year where law students or people applying for certain jobs were being deplatformed from the job or from the placement into a graduate program, all because they said they do not support the Israeli attack on Gaza. And this all harkens to the way in which we're programmed by not only political machinery or the fact that we have to get used to the idea that war is important. These scare tactics you spoke of earlier, used all the time. The quote I gave by Reagan, oh my God, he was full of those quotes. The commie scare he reinvoked in the 1980s is now sort of funny when you read back on them. But the cost of lives in Nicaragua and Honduras, El Salvador, these are places where huge swathes of the population were killed. And people hear the word students. It's important to understand in Latin America, education is free. Hello, people in the US. And so they are not paying for their education, so just like in much of Europe. So when they're going after students, it's not like Harvard students, they're protesting against Gaza. We're talking about, these are often workers' children, middle-class children, who would not be able to afford the kinds of extortionate prices in the US. So we have now this world, Joti, where the left and right have fragmented. You described the conditions of workers in the early 18th century, the 1980s of Thatcher. And then today, we're facing these experiments of the 4-day work week, but maybe not fast enough. We hear about satellite towns. Thatcher and even Major, they destroyed social housing. We're facing the greatest crisis of poverty. We're seeing nutrition go downhill, right? We know why, but no one wants to talk about that. We've had fatness rebranded as healthy. And I think it's really important to talk about, I don't even mean chronic obesity. We should just be able to talk frankly without the political police coming forth and saying, you're this, that, ism, whatever. And then we have the other issue, you mentioned the trans issue, but let's talk about Marx and immigration, because that lesson, I think a lot of people, when they saw Trump and the wall, Biden did the same stuff, by the way, it's easy to say that people against immigration are just flat out racists. And we've seen this with certain types of representations within major media of Trump, but not only Trump, Hungary's prime minister, even Meloni here. And we've seen how being a conservative, in air quotes, because what does that mean anymore now? When we're seeing that being cast as being akin to being a Nazi or akin to being a racist, Marx warned about the way immigration would be used to drive down workers' wages. And here we are seeing the right take the lead in talking about workers' wages, because what's happened to the unions? How is racism and even xenophobia being weaponized?
Absolutely. So many things. Just very briefly, as I go through some of the things you've brought up, we should take note that the Cold War was not that cold. Across the oppressed world, the Cold War was a hot war, and it was a war against communism. If you look at those years between 1950 and 1990 and add up the number of communists or suspected communists or people who might one day become communists who were killed for that reason, it's in the tens of millions across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Huge numbers of people were killed, and movements, you know, as you described in Nicaragua, but happened in so many countries. You know, let's not forget that 1950 to 53 was the war in Korea. 5 million Korean people. 5 million. I mean, it's a genocide, right? And that kicked off with the so-called Cold War, right? It was an endless series of genocides. You know, 1 million communists massacred in Indonesia. It goes on and on and on in every country in Latin America. Some communists.
Meanwhile, we were brainwashed. Remember those nuclear war drills when you had to get under your desk?
Right. We're blackmailed with the idea that the most terrible thing that can happen is a nuclear confrontation, while they're actually out there massacring by the million working class people who were trying to get free. You know.
You're not talking about the manufacture of Agent Orange, among others.
And we're told we've got peace, you know, while they're doing it. I mean, you know what? It's really 1984, isn't it? Peace is war.
It really is. It's trans women are women political style.
Right. So, you know, again, you see the pact with the devil that happens when you live in an imperialist country. Turn your eyes away from the bloodshed that's being done as long as you're all right. As long as your conditions of life are okay, don't ask where the money's come from, or what the relationship is between you and all of the bloodshed elsewhere. And, you know, this is the job that communists have abdicated in, you know, with the decline of our movement through the 50s, and why it's in such desperate need of a rebirth, the world communist movement on a real scientific footing again, is because without communists, real communists who study Marxism and study Lenin and base themselves in that understanding and bring that understanding to the masses in their countries, there is no one who can give the workers the requisite history and context to make sense of anything they see. There's nobody else who does that, right? So this gap where the communists used to be is what's filled with the culture wars and the identity politics and all kinds of other nonsense, you know. But context and history are, you know, examining phenomena in its context, what it's connected to, and in its motion. That's where the historical part comes in, right? What direction is it moving in? Where has it come from? Where's it going to? This is the essence of a Marxist analysis and understanding. And it's why Marxism is so powerful for the working class, because it really makes sense of things. And once you've understood something properly, you can't be bullshitted by the fake narratives, the spin, which is the one thing the imperialists are still really, really good at. Is spin, is dominating the media landscape and spinning everything and creating all these narratives. But if you know some truths, it doesn't work on you, right? So they have to keep you ignorant, and they manipulate your ignorance. This idea that I just wanted to touch on briefly, who you vote for, you know, makes a difference to the war machine. It's a yes and a no, I think, from me, in the sense that actually, I think what we got with Trump is it's very obvious he was a disruptor. He wasn't the chosen candidate of the elite. The reason being, I think, that he represents, for all he's a billionaire, right? He represents the small billions versus the big billions. Right? It sounds funny, but you know, in times when the super rich are so gigantically rich, and monopolies are so enormous, the smaller capitalists can still be very, very rich, but they just don't have any muscle compared to the really big ones. Trump comes from enough money to be able to fund a presidential campaign. That's a lot of money, right? He's not poor, but he looks like the underdog because he's not the face of the super rich who like their mandarins to be fully under their control and not have independent means where they might go off and say something that wasn't on the message, right? They like the Obama type, you know, someone who's Blair, someone who's slick, looks good in a suit, can present, you know, pretend to be sincere, can spout lies, and will do anything for the money, basically, and commit any crime while pretending to do the opposite and, you know, speaking in a politically correct way, all while they're, you know, massacring millions around the world. That's what the imperialists want for their system. They want a good front person, and Trump is not a good front person. Trump says the quiet part out loud. That makes him disruptive and dangerous. And, you know, when Trump was being elected, our party, we did a leaflet, we did some articles that really upset some people, because we said, well, we think this is a better outcome for the world's working class than who was the alternative? Hillary Clinton, wasn't it? Actually, we think this is a better outcome for these various reasons. He's a disruptor. And he says he doesn't want war with Russia. So let's see what comes out of that, right? But also because we called him a loose cannon on the deck, because he's firing in all directions, right? He's random and uncontrolled, and some of his bullets are hitting his own side. He's exposing things that aren't supposed to be exposed, like in Syria when he said, well, we're there for the oil. You're not supposed, that we know it's true. You're not supposed to say it out loud. He said there's deep state machinations going on. Well, I would just call it the state. But what he's identifying is there's an unelected layer of people who actually run things, and you don't know who they are and you don't know how they make the decisions. It's totally, so deep is right in the sense of there's no transparency. We don't see who these people are. We don't follow them in Vanity Fair. We don't elect them. We're not privy to any of their decision-making processes or the mechanisms by which they get their decisions implemented. And yet there are those people there running things. And, you know, so that's not a conspiracy. That's a fact of how capitalism operates, right? That's been well documented. And, you know, if you read Lenin's book on imperialism about how the financial oligarchy maintains its rule, no matter which politicians are elected, you know, it's all very clear. It's not actually changed. So I think Trump helped us, in fact, to see that. You know, he was a disruptor, but he also showed how the president is not actually the person who makes the decisions. We can see it again with Joe Biden, because, I mean, the guy's obviously, you know, should be in an old people's home. He's got dementia, and yet someone's making decisions, right? They got this guy up front pretending that it's him, but it's clear that it's not him, right? It's people behind him. He's got handlers, but even his handlers are just middlemen, you know. And the reality, as we saw with Trump, if he expressed an interest in doing something that the ruling class didn't want him to do, he found very quickly that it didn't get done. He thought he was pulling troops out of Syria, but he wasn't allowed to do that. It was decided that they were not going to come out, and they didn't come out. You know, he had talked before he went into office about pardoning Assange. That didn't happen. And the reason for it not happening is totally obscure. I've heard Judge Napolitano talking about having direct conversations with Trump, where it sort of sounds like someone had got to him and threatened him with something terrifying, you know, and that he quickly about faced. So you suddenly realize, and this is an important lesson for the workers to understand, who you vote for makes no difference. The ruling class stays in power. The president is not the person who is in charge of the state, nor is the prime minister, right? These politicians are there. It's a bit like the rest of the clown show, right? The identity politics, the culture wars. It's like a massive distraction to keep us all busy. In America, you have this weird thing where the election cycle is all the time, and all these fake debates that go with it, and all these fake differences between the uniparty, the polls of the uniparty, and there's this whole, you know, hundreds of 24-hour news channel all following these fake debates, and it's this massive facade, a massive machine of distraction.
And the media takes part. I mean, when I heard the media cover the debate over the red line that Biden has completely betrayed, they just go along with it. It's like, I don't know if you've watched Glenn Greenwald. He's been taking the piss out of Jen Psaki, as she should be destroyed, because she's a political pawn who went from the White House to major media. And major media is part of the political mechanism. There's no more division.
No, absolutely not. It's all a coordinated machinery. It's a kind of a Hollywood show, basically, to keep you busy looking over here. As my friend and I, when we used to be involved in union negotiations, you know, she had this way of describing how the bosses, when we were trying to negotiate with them, would try to get us to go down avenues of argument which were tangential and beside the point. and to distract you from what you were trying to focus on, all the time. And she described this strategy as what you do with little kids. Look, balloons, right? Yeah, look over there, look, balloons. Look, to take their mind off something that you don't want them to think about. They're looking at the chocolate bar, and down there you go, look, balloons, right? And this whole thing, this massive machinery can be seen in that light, right? It's a massive distraction paraphernalia to keep your attention, to get you bogged down in fighting with other people about things which are not the issue, right? Instead of uniting and understanding that our common enemy is the ruling class, who are running all of this clown show to keep us busy and divided amongst ourselves. And you really have to see the immigration issue as in the same way. The two alternatives we are given, none of them make sense. Fundamentally, immigration on a mass scale is created by the conditions of imperialism. Imperialist war, imperialist enslavement and destruction of other countries' economies, whether they're fleeing from the economic inability to feed their families or the physical inability to keep their families alive. People leave their homes en masse in big numbers. I don't mean the odd person who just travels for adventure and fun, but I mean in the big numbers that we see out of desperation, not because they wanted to. And that condition is just a reality of life under capitalism, life under imperialism. And we are not going to change that by either demonizing the immigrants or saying, oh, well, it's jolly good that they come and do work that nobody here wants to do, right? It's a weirdly patronizing way of talking about, desperate people who are forced to work for shit-paying conditions. If you don't want workers to pull down your pay and conditions under capitalism, number one, you have to recognize they always will. In the earlier stages of capitalist development, what exercised the downward pull on workers' wages? It was the constant influx of new peasants who'd been freed from the land, freed as in kicked off the land, arrive in the cities desperate for work, right? Always a new flood of labor. And when that wasn't happening, the imperialists started importing labor from other parts of the world very early on. Before imperialism proper as a systematic global system had been, established, from the very earliest days of capitalist development, they were bringing in sources of labor to keep the price of labor down. It's part of the workings of the capitalist system. It's a requirement in capitalism. So when the ruling class pretends to want to stop immigration, it doesn't. It needs it. But when workers fall for this, either to believe that their rulers are trying to somehow protect them when they legislate against migration, and buy into all kinds of racist narratives, that's one misdirection. It's a lie. What we have to understand is, number one, it can't be stopped. So all of the paraphernalia of pretending to try and stop it is just a show. It can't be stopped because it's been created by the system, by the action of the wars and the impoverishment and the indebtedness and the destruction of people's economies at home and all the rest of it. And people come because they have to. They come because they know there's work, right? They don't go to places where there's no work, but the conditions that they experience are advantageous, yes, for the capitalists, and disadvantageous to the workers. But that doesn't mean that we as workers should say, oh, right, no immigration then. It's an impossible demand under capitalism. Number one, we have to say, look, these problems are created by imperialism. We have to abolish imperialism. Number two, we need to recognize these immigrants are our class brothers and sisters. They are victims of the system the same as us. If we really think there's a way under capitalism to stop them being a pull on our wages downwards under the present relations of production, what we need to be fighting for is unity. Because if we're all, unified and working together, if we struggle together against the capitalists, if we struggle even within the conditions of capitalism, if we unionize together and demand the same rights for all workers, then the ability to use them as an underclass who don't even get minimum wage, who don't have any rights at work, you know, and who therefore exert a downward pull on everybody's paying conditions, that becomes negated by the action of the workers in pulling together. But that's on us to do. Right? Blaming the immigrants for the fact that the capitalists use them and prey on them so terribly, blaming them for that situation they find themselves in, which they have no control over, but which we could do something about ourselves by unifying with them and demanding equal pay for all the workers, then that is doing the job of the capitalists for them. And essentially, the immigration debate that always comes up around election time is it's another massive distraction. It's a plea from the ruling class to blame other workers for the problems of the system and to identify with our exploiters against these poor, benighted victims of the system, some of the most put upon, most abused victims of global capitalism. We are blaming for the crimes of the capitalist system. And when we do so, we identify ourselves with our own exploiters. And that just keeps us all weak and stupid.
Absolutely. And the most cynical part of this charade is how the mostly Western countries have set up this human rights / refugee / survivor of natural disaster / but all these programs from the UN. I'm very critical about this because I've seen it firsthand in so many paradigms, but where this relief class of people, they would have been the knights and the courtier, once upon a time, but now they have jobs because they went to usually an elite university, got a job, and they're a P3, 4, 5 in the UN structures, and they're managing a population that has experienced a flood. People from everywhere, Wyoming, San Francisco, Tierra del Fuego, but the elite of these places are all at this UN camp figuring out how they're going to fix the problem. Now, I think of this wonderful book, Paul Rabinow, who was a translator of Foucault's work, but Rabinow, as an anthropologist, wrote this wonderful book called French Modern. And he discusses how the French made their modernist projects in their colonial spaces. Hence, you will see it. I mean, Italy did the same. If you go to Asmara in Ethiopia, where modern architecture, that's the only place on the planet that has like huge lines of architecture that's from the modernist era in this specific way. I guess maybe a bit of Mussolini's fascist architecture resembles it, but then, not completely, but then you've got all these aid workers coming in. So you get new university recruits coming in to work in IDP camps, to work in border safe houses, to organize the transfer of this food to this famine population. And it all sounds good on paper. But we have to be really cynical about this because the US is funding these aid workers to go, even as the UN, to go to Gaza and clean up the mess that we've created. And this is a huge problem, not just direct bombing, as we've done in other countries, or the proxy war in Ukraine, but also the indirect, the sale of arms. And so we're cleaning up with the left hand and funding wars with the right. I mean, how cynical is that?
Absolutely. And, it again comes down to a very basic question, doesn't it, about capitalism or socialism? It's like capitalism creates inequalities, it destroys lives and impoverishes people. But then some of the people at the top who are benefiting from the system get a bit of a guilty conscience and they do a bit of charity and then they get lauded. Oh, isn't this guy, he's a great philanthropist. Like, what a lovely guy he is, that all of the wealth, somebody's sitting on a pile of wealth. That wealth was created by workers who are poor, right? He got rich out of the poverty of others. That's how it works. And the idea that the rich then graciously grant some of their wealth as back to you as largesse, and you're supposed to be grateful. Right. This fundamental, are we going to solve the problems of society through charity or through appropriation? And the fundamental truth is that, of course, what we need is a new society. We need to appropriate the expropriators, as Marx put it. And take hold of these huge productive forces, this huge social wealth. It's not the wealth of individuals. It's been appropriated by individuals, but it's been created by the labor of all of society. This is the thing that's really obscene. Everybody works, but all the wealth that's being produced by the work of all of those people is in the hands of this tiny, tiny, tiny oligarchy, who then decide who gets to have a bit of charity while they salve their consciences. And this phenomenon then seeps through into the mindset of the privileged sections of the upper working class in the rich countries, who imbibe this mentality, this kind of messiah complex, and this sense of guilt. Identity politics, all the oppression hierarchies, they're also built on this imperialist guilt, right? There's no point feeling guilty for what you were lucky or unlucky enough to be born into. The question is, what are you going to do with it, right? So you've been born with this X amount of resources at your disposal, X amount of education, X amount of opportunity to do or not do whatever you can. The question is, what will you do with what you've got, and how will you make your life count? Now, what a lot of people who are privileged do is try to salve their consciences whilst keeping the system that gives them privilege in place. And a lot of what goes on here is this on the one hand, the charity is for conscience salving. It's window dressing on the system. That, oh, look, we've got a heart, we care. People who feel conscience ridden get involved in that activity, which is utterly pointless. It's not even putting a sticking plaster onto a gaping wound. It's not even that much. It's a joke, but it does keep a few people busy and you can always point to it and say, look at the charitable works, look at the good things we do, look at our programs to try and help the victims of our aggressive wars, right? But also there's another aspect that I think is even more insidious, actually, to this machinery, and that's the NGOization of the resistance. Because all over the world, you look at communities that are suffering, and the people that their communities produce in the oppressed world, who would naturally come to the top and surface as leaders, community leaders, and if they weren't interfered with, would then become the people who led resistance in their communities. They get captured by the NGOs. They get given jobs. They become professionalized. Sorry, darling. They become professionalized, and they end up being the dolers out, the professional dolers out of imperialist charity to their communities, instead of the voices of and leaders of their communities' anti-imperialist resistance.
So many good points that you raise here. And there has been, as Adolf Reed calls it, this managerial class. And it's a professionalism of overseers, those who might, during the Industrial Revolution, have been overseers in the coal field, telling people what to do. Now, today, we have expanded the managerial class because some people want to still be upper middle class and not lose that footing. So they send their kid to a good university and they're a relief worker, right? And I help people. And it's this kind of narrative that it doesn't just exist on the professional scale, it filters through our culture, where people believe, even though they might not understand anything about how the UN works or the fact that there's a Security Council that is permanent, and they might think this is really good because it sounds good. What's not to like? Nations, plural, many people united together. Great. Anything with united in front of it sounds sort of pacific, right? It's not like warring or opposed. So people tend to just give it a pass. And at the same time, if you criticize the UN 20 years ago, you were considered of the far right. But there's a lot to criticize because you talk about the way that the fourth world, as I'll call it, has experienced the wars of the US and how obviously immigration is a product of our wars, but people don't want to see it. And it's like, are you understanding? Like here in Berlin right now, thousands of Syrians are coming. They're not coming here because they saw a telefilm about living right here. No, they're coming because they've been disavowed of any place to live. And people don't understand that Syria was a huge crisis and blowback result of Iraq 2. And Iraq 2 is very related to Iraq 1, but we won't go there. The thing is that so many people follow the news as if it's a telenovela, and they just accept at face value what they're being told without asking, but wait, why are we being given the Red Scare again? This is like 2.0, super hard. It was much more than what Reagan did, or maybe 3.0 at this point. But we're getting the Red Scare. We're being told China, Russia. There's very little mention of BRICS in major media, but you'll see it in independent media because it's a thing. The rest of the world's countries are saying, hey, we don't want to be in the club where the bully's ruling. You know, this is like high school. Let's create the geek club. So, you know, Brazil and China and Russia and South Africa, you know, and other countries are joining, have created this alliance where they're sort of pushing back. Why not? I mean, it is capitalism, right? But that's when we'll see the double-edged sword coming into play. It's one rule for me and another rule for you. So we're seeing how capitalism is having a lot of different formations and even dispersions and in dissolutions for certain. And most Americans are not even aware of what decolonization was about. So I'm seeing feminists online. I'm going to talk about them again because I think it's important to understand that the aporia of knowledge about Gaza amongst many British feminists is really alarming to me. When I saw people say, I'm going to the March for Peace. But wait, why can't you just join the people the next day who are having the pro-Gaza march? Because they're peaceful too, but somehow those two marches, one day after another, were somehow kept separate. Like the idea of marching for peace could never have anything to do with marching for Gaza, right? So that was set up. The neoliberals who were like, oh, but the anti-Semitism. Well, we could do a whole week's show on just what happened to Corbyn and the anti-Semitism claims, even if I'm not a Corbyn fan, I have a lot of criticisms of him, but that was insane. And the way that anti-Semitism has now, in a very short time, I'm rather surprised, been getting so debunked by excellent alternative news sources that it's not major media. But we're now able to finally say, okay, if you stand for women's rights, you should probably not be on the side of war, because I don't even want to begin the list of what happens to women and children in war, and they're horrible things, not feminist things. I have a problem with that. Then I have a problem with the fact that we grew up in countries that were relatively well off compared to the rest of the world. But to be taught the world as it should be represented in truth, we're not given that. So Americans are taught about World War II, never taught that Russia took the heaviest casualty load by far. And we're taught to fear the Soviet Union. And all this stuff is very interesting how it's taught. There are exceptions, overwhelmingly not. And so we have this system where we're taught to basically be corralled early on into a certain ideology. Hence, the two-party system in the States is a complete disaster. The most obvious candidate to vote for in this next election would be Jill Stein, but she doesn't have an ice cube's chance in hell of winning. And of course, it'll be Trump if he's not put into prison before. And even that has to be debunked because those charges are bullshit. I'm sorry, like Glenn Greenwald did a great show on this last week or the week before about how this is really one charge, just repeated, because it's like a log entry. But anyways, it's one charge and Hillary's done it. So we're looking at this circus. The clown car comes in, more clown cars. There's so many clown cars some of these days. And then we're being told we should be on the side of Ukraine for what political use? That we should be interested in protecting the state of Israel for what narrative purposes? And we're being told so many stories that make people sort of throw their hands up. Even people who might be on our side in terms of believing in the rights of Palestinian people and Palestinian statehood, which has now been proposed to the UN to be recognized. A lot of people don't have the material to make an informed decision as they would like, because the fact that the media is just shooting hulls of mirrors at us every day of the week. The BBC's turned into Hello Magazine. I laugh at it all the time because you get more star stories than you do real media stories. I'm talking about the website, by the way, not the radio. We're really in a conundrum, I guess, politically speaking, on the war front, because who is in power making the arms? Who is having the student protests around the world, or even workers' protests around the world? And yet, workers' rights are being corrupted even from within. You wrote a piece about, in fact, on the problems of the labor unions in Assange. Where are the labor unions? Why is there this kind of nod to propaganda coming through the BBC and ABC and CNN, et cetera, et cetera?
Absolutely. So many things. You know, despite the absence of good, strong, solid, prominent communist organizations and socialist Marxist media to help the working class navigate the situation it's in and make sense of it, we are still getting a red scare, fundamentally because the imperialists understand that it's socialism that represents their biggest enemy. They're coming into a crisis that's so deep and going to get deeper. And the crisis, the economic crisis, they're doing everything they can to pass the backs of that onto the poor. So the situation for ordinary people is becoming worse and worse very fast. And that's accompanied as well by an accelerating drive to war. As we talked about earlier, the drive to war comes from the need to loot, to try to and find, you know, manufacture weapons and destroy things so you can rebuild them, you know, reboot your economy somehow through a combination of those factors. So this drive to war it comes from the economic crisis. The economic crisis affects workers with terrible wages, terrible conditions, homelessness, unemployment, you know, poverty, all of that. And it's all getting worse, and the inflation, you know, is going through the roof and will continue to, despite everything that they're telling us about how they've got it under control. They don't. So all of that is happening, and the ruling class understands that they need to do everything in their power to keep the working class away from Marxism, because Marxism explains to them what's happening and also explains to them what the solution is. And in this situation, the need for resistance, the need for solutions is growing, and the number of people looking around for answers is growing because the need for solutions is growing. People's lives are getting rapidly worse, and that makes people look up and question, right? And that is going to be accelerating as a process over the coming years. So there's a big push by the ruling class to fill in the space, to confuse people about what Marxism is, to scare them away from trying to find out, to present all kinds of things as progressive, which are not, which is the whole identity politics thing, is to give us culture wars where we fight one another endlessly and constantly, and where we look to our rulers and identify with them in various ways, rather than identifying with other workers against the system. So all of that, you know, that's why it's because of the crisis, because of the drive to war, because of the declining, rapidly declining conditions of existence for people everywhere, that they need to have this red scare and demonize socialism, even though in many ways you would say, well, surely, you know, the socialist parties, the real communists are so marginal in the West right now. Why are they still being targeted? And yet, look at this. Let me just tell you this little story, Julian. In Britain, well, not only in Britain, but in Britain particularly, there's been this interesting thing of rebranding. So Trotskyism used to be the favored, for a long time, has been the favored tool of the imperialists to disrupt the communist movement. They dress up in the clothes of Leninism. They look like revolutionaries. They sound very revolutionary. But actually, all of their activity and all of their program and all of their propaganda reinforces imperialism when you actually get right down, bury down, and look at it, what it really consists of. So the state has always backed and supported and promoted Trotskyite organizations amongst the working class, and especially amongst the students, to try to divert a whole load of potential revolutionary energy away from Marxism. But Trotskyism in the last 10, 15 years has been really declining in the Western countries for a whole bunch of reasons I won't go into. Well, suddenly there's this one little party that had almost disappeared, that suddenly, and it's part of an international, so it's across Europe and North America, it's been given this massive reboot. And there's no way there's not a whole load of state funding involved, because they've had this big rebrand, a big reboot, and from being what they were called socialist appeal, they have rebranded themselves as the Revolutionary Communist Party. Now, that is nothing if not an attempt to troll young revolutionary-minded people who don't know anything about Marxism and make them think that this is a Marxist party. Within a week of their official relaunch, Michael Gove had mentioned the name of their party in a list of people who we should be opposing and who are dangerous to society, right? If that is not a hefty bit of state marketing to the young people, to tell them these are the parties for you to join, I don't know what is. And the algorithms are pushing their content massively. Everybody I know who's a lefty, who's on social media, YouTube, Twitter, they're all getting the content of this organization, the rebranded RCP, pushed at them really heavily. Again, there's no way that's happening without the active involvement of those media organizations, right? Because the algorithms are being spun in the favor of this group. Now, we had an interesting, this is why I really know it's a psyop. Not only they rebranded themselves The Communist, right? Their newspaper is called The Communist. They are so not communist, right? Their newspaper is called The Communist. And our party a few years ago changed the banner at the top of our website, because, you know, our party name's quite long, and we changed the banner at the top of our website and the title on our Telegram channel to just The Communists. So these people are now selling a newspaper called The Communist. Recently, you think we're so small, we're so marginal, they've done a very good job of not promoting. We get suppressed in all the algorithms, so it's hard for our content to reach people who don't already know about us. And when there's an official policy in the British ruling class media to never mention the name of our party, so that we don't get promoted to people, where, the Socialist Workers' Party, for example, they'll always mention, because they want to siphon people to, if they're feeling rebellious, towards a Trotskyite group, and they don't want them to know that we exist. So we had a situation a couple of times recently as part of the Palestine solidarity movement. We were not the only people who've been targeted, but we had a couple of quite high profile arrests of our people for selling the first one was for selling a pamphlet against Zionism, and we were arrested under the Incitement to Racial Hatred Public Order Act. And the second time it was for giving out a leaflet in support of the Palestinian resistance, and that was under the Terrorism Act, support for a banned organization, Hamas. Of course, the leaflet doesn't mention Hamas, it mentions the Palestinian people's right to resist, right? But anyway, so these arrests, the first one particularly, went kind of viral in the Palestine solidarity social media world, because the one of the people who was arrested was my brother, and he's a very eloquent person. And while he was being arrested, he was basically berating the policeman and giving him a lecture on British imperialism and war crimes and all this. And people were filming it, and so it kind of went viral and got a lot of attention. And so did our pamphlet on Zionism. We kind of circulated it for free digitally, and that went across, that exploded across the English-speaking internet. Loads and loads of people saw it who'd never heard of it before. So, that was really interesting how that happened. Within a few weeks of that event, even maybe 2 weeks, the Socialist Appeal, who were in the process of rebranding themselves as the Communists, right, posted a video online, a live stream. They live streamed one of their people getting arrested. And he was, get this, so part of the reason Ranjit's arrest got a lot of attention was because while he was being arrested, he was saying to the policeman, "I'm an NHS doctor," right? So get this, the Socialist Appeal posts this video, live stream an arrest. So they're live streaming this arrest. That implies a bit of forethought, right, of the whole thing. They're live streaming this arrest of a young Asian doctor called Raj. My brother's name is Ranjit, right? On the Palestine solidarity demonstration, he gets very politely arrested, no cuffs. He's released a few hours later. It's all live streamed, right? The whole thing was so clearly a kind of piggybacking and using the algorithm to attract some of the sympathy and some of the awareness around what had happened to our party towards this, suddenly very heavily promoted, rebranded Trotskyite group. The whole thing was fascinating to see how, even though we're so small and have such difficulty making meaningful connections with the masses, at this moment, the ruling class understands what the working class doesn't, which is our ideology and our analysis and our ability to explain the truth to people and help them to see what the solution is. It's dangerous right now, precisely because there is a mass movement, and it might start to connect with us. And heaven forfend, what would the consequences be if people start to actually find us and find the analysis that we've got? And so there's really quick move to try to divert that and promote something that looks like us but isn't us, which I find fascinating, and really goes to show that the ruling class understands what a lot of the workers still don't, which is that the fundamental threat to their rule comes from the connection between Marxist analysis and a mass movement.